Really happy to be talking about developer experience today. There's a special track in API Days, so kudos to API Days for that. So we'll be specifically talking about does your API actually need SDKs for better API onboarding? And looking at it as a business case perspective. So I wanted to put a question in front of you first. Did any of you ever had to face budget issues? Well, given the current economic circumstances, let's cut ever and let's ask maybe, has anyone ever faced a budget issue in the last 3 months? By the raise of hand. Well, a few hands, right? So yes, with the economic correction happening now with everything, there has to be a value and a budget conversation if it needs to be approved for the next year. And so we'll sort of take a business case approach to developer experience. So the budget conversation is usually in terms of management, it's about costs, but the way to get through it is to have that value conversation. How much of value are you adding to the business? Does it make sense? So if you're building a business case, there was a list that I took from Chase Consulting Group, who put it in a very simple way. So first of all, you have to answer, should you consider investing at all? Should you, make the investment in the first place? For that, once that's sorted out, you look at the alternatives, do a cost-benefit analysis, which alternates are more profitable, and sort of make your recommendations accordingly. So just to simplify all of that, you need to be clear on the objectives or goals that you want to achieve. What's the value it's going to add? Explore all the alternates available in the market, and then entail all the benefits and risks, and then you recommend a strategy. The way we're going to do it today will be differently, where even starting from the goal, we're going to be talking about all the benefits and the risks, and then we'll go to the approaches on how to build a business case. Right, so why developer onboarding is important, or why developer experience is important. This is a quick picture that I took from today's opening speech by Mark O'Neill from Gartner. And he was talking about the next 10 years. And if you see, there are just 2 sections where it says market gap. First, more tooling to help with API consumption. So they're seeing the need growing on that size. The world has focused a lot on API first design, API management, but the ROI comes from getting those APIs eventually consumed by the developers. And again, the other one is about, again, developer experience, that decoupling API developer platforms from the gateway and just focus on gateway on the management and design side, while we need to figure out the consumption side. Quickly, let's see if our SDK is important for API onboarding. So let's look at a developer's journey from an onboarding perspective. Imagine this pirate is a developer and it wants to build an their first hello world and build their first proof of concept of the integration. So you provide them with the API reference, right? But once they go through the API reference, they discover your API, then they have to go through some more stages before they actually reach the treasure chest, right? So that includes configuration, figuring out the authentication bit, serialization, and going forward to deserialize the body response and so on and so forth. So basically what they would need after API reference would be the sample code, the authentication code, the integration code for the requests, and the interaction code for the response side of things. Instead of taking all these developers through this journey, why don't we make that journey easy, right? And this is what the faster API onboarding is all about. Provide them API reference, provide them code samples that they can play around with and feel comfortable with, assisted authentication, and SDKs and client libraries in the language of their preference. So let's have a look at the industry and see some market validation if it makes sense. Let's quickly look at the top unicorns of the API first world. I believe everybody knows these APIs. All of them provide SDKs, all of them. And this is a screenshot from Algolia where they actually recommend so they have an API reference, but they recommend using their official SDKs to onboard the API. Okay, but these are the top APIs, right? What about the others? Let's expand the search on the popular APIs. So we did something a while ago, and we looked at some of the popular APIs you see here, apart from those unicorns. All of them go beyond API reference, and they try to speak the language of developers. They provide tutorials, SDKs in multiple languages, to getting started guides, and so on and so forth. Let's change our scope even more. So those APIs that we discuss are here. That's another sort of infographic or third-party API economy that came probably a year ago with most popular APIs. Some of them are missing. But even then, we had a look. There are 80 plus APIs product companies. 70% of them provide SDKs. So we looked it up last week, and that was an interesting story. So today, Mehdi showed the API landscape of these 1,000 plus APIs. Don't worry, I'm not going to, I don't have the calculation today on how many of these provide SDKs, but our goal would be to see that all of these APIs provide amazing onboarding as well, like the top tier. So when we're sorting out, who is your target audience, right? It's developers. But do you see them in a single scope? The world sees them sort of as a single sort of unit. But there are microsegments with different needs, right? Not all developers are equal. So the requirement of a Java developer would be different from a Python developer. So you need to see which developers your APIs is being focused on and sort of scale your program accordingly. And let's dive deeper into understanding the personas that your APIs are targeting. So this is sort of a developer experience pyramid by one of a good friend, Keith Casey. You can check out his blog around it. So in the top of the pyramid are the superheroes, the 1% of developers, so we call 10x developers. Problem solvers, superheroes, you throw them just API spec and they will figure everything out. They love problems. But then the 99% of developers live in the mainstream one, right? Where they are there, but they would need they would need some help, hand-holding from you. Then comes the framework developers. So for example, somebody is working in Ruby on Rails rather than Ruby on Apidays, or React frameworks, right? They would need certain different types of help to get on board on your API. And then last is the majority, which is pretty much non-developers, the low-code, no-code community, where the business users are interacting with your APIs as well. So the top two tiers, of course, would be interacting with the whole API, with detailed use cases, while the last two would have limited usage around your API. And what do they need? Like I said, 10x developers would be fine with an API reference. They usually like to figure stuff out. But if you go down, mainstream developers would be using multiple use cases, and they would need SDKs and code samples to figure stuff out. And of course, as you go down, it's limited focus, limited use cases. You can provide plugins and widgets, and low-code, no-code connectors similarly for the non-developers. But how do you maintain these? So for the top two, of course, you generate via OpenAPI spec. That's what we recommend. API reference, SDK sample code can be generated. We'll talk about in detail on how it can be made better. But the other two required manual effort in building those plugins and widgets as well. So what we figured out, or what we found out from our customers, was they ultimately started using the API reference and SDKs to sort of semi-automate the widget process. So it's easier, so they would dog food their own SDKs and build these low-code, no-code components easier. So that's the best you could do. But now if you look at your API, figure out which personas is your API targeting or you targeting at the moment. And then, so for example, if you're at the mainstream developer level, you cannot live without SDKs, and this is where the most value would come from. And of course, in the top and the bottom tier, SDKs do add value as well in that sense. This is sort of a different perspective on API complexity versus product application. So if so API complexity on y-axis and number of use cases that your API entails is on the x-axis. So as So as the complexity increases, so with lower complexity and the lower number of use cases, you're fine with it. It's a simple API. Not many use cases, you can give out an API reference. But as the complexity of API increases, it could be in the number of APIs or the complex models involved in there. But there are very specific use cases. For example, an e-commerce API is just only used in, for example, Shopify plugin could be good enough to sort them out. But if the use cases keep increasing, then you have to provide SDKs to the developers, those client code libraries, so that they can sort of satisfy their use case. I hope I am on time. So let's go about on talking about estimating the effort on it. So there's, it's a complex slide, but I wouldn't go in detail. But you can check out a talk by my colleague Adil and Mehdi from Apidays Australia or Apidays New York. They talk about this in detail on how to create the right SDKs. But they need to be accessible, approachable. Maintenance is something that's the biggest pain we've seen. And if you work with them, you'd see that, you know, that's the biggest hassle. Probably 80% of the cost that goes in once you've provided the SDKs is there. But is providing, you know, throwing the spec in a code generator and providing SDK good enough? Well, not really. You have to provide the whole ecosystem. So SDKs should come with tutorials, getting started guides, an API playground with them. The documentation, you need to publish packages, for example. The code samples that you provide should not be boilerplate code. That should be those code samples that your users can use with that client code as well to get to their first hello world. And if you look at the industry, some companies like Stripe and Square, they provide sample apps on top of their SDKs as well. So user can quickly build over on top of those. So let's quickly look at the options.
I think you have around 10 minutes.
10 minutes. So OK, I've moved quite fast then. Awesome. Thank you. So what are your options? First, do nothing. So out of those 1,000 APIs, I do not think everybody provides SDKs. But then what are you doing with that? You're putting on the cost of development, that integration cost on your developer. So you're assuming that providing an API reference is good enough for them, and now they will have to figure out all the integration bit. And imagine if a developer takes a week to integrate with your API. Imagine the same step that we saw the Pirate doing. Imagine 1,000 developers doing the same thing that you could have provided directly to them. So do nothing is not an option. 5 years ago, manual SDKs were an option. But given the time and restricted resources on development, you don't find developers to do the main product work, let alone manually maintaining SDKs. So that's something that is out of the option. I don't see anyone doing SDKs manually. If somebody is, they should have left doing that 5 years ago. But then the other bit which became quite popular was picking up an open source generator like an Open API generator, so I got CodeGen tooling, and generate SDKs. Fourth option I'm not talking about, but let's dig down on this option because this had become quite popular as well. But what we seen with that it usually works if your API is simple enough. There are not going to be many changes. There's not much maintenance cost. But what if all of this is not true? So for example, let's talk about the maintenance and depth. So we've already talked about this, or at least I've given you reference. Setting all these criteria up using your sort of open source tooling would take a lot of effort. And those SDKs need to have some depth as well. So they are not, so what we sort of figured out, and APImatic sort of helped some of the partners that we're helping with, was that yes, providing an API wrapper in the first 2 layers, that's the start of an SDK. But why stop there? For example, Stripe's SDK, yes, they do an Open API spec coverage, authentication, all the endpoints data is there, error handling is done, models are there, but they also do retries and caching for their developers. Why not do that for them? How about handling the authentication for them? So all of these layers ultimately made our integration, we learned that we need to add that in our integration code or in the client code that we're generating. And if we go down, what about the SDK ecosystem? So if you're taking a code generator and building the SDK, what about the guides? You will need a technical writer to write guides on them. The code samples, you would need to write those as well. And again, they need to be idiomatic as well. And then, consistency bit is if you see most of the developer portal where they're providing SDKs, they would do the first step of providing amazing API reference, right? There would be a beautiful console, code sample, curl commands, getting started guides, try it out, everything is there. But when it comes to SDKs, there would be a hidden link down there that there are SDKs, and then you would have just repos sitting on there, right? Developers won't use them. So you need to treat your SDK users as first-class citizens as well. They deserve the same experience, right, as well. You're already going the extra mile to providing the code. Why not do it like why not treat them like you're treating your API reference users? And then it comes the scaling issue. You can generate it for 1 API or 2 or 10. How about an ecosystem of 50 API or maybe 200, right? How would you scale across APIs, across 8 to 10 languages? Then there's a standardization issue that comes in. And the other thing that we've seen quite a lot is what if you spent a year in sort of setting out all the SDKs, and then after a year and a half, your champions decide to leave, your key program manager decide to leave. I would not name an API program, but it's a competitor of Stripe. Actually, they had to revamp their SDK program 3 times in the last 5 years. Imagine the cost that's going to come on. And ultimately, you're going to decide to not invest in that anymore, just because you didn't take the right approach. So business case or value doesn't mean, so it has to be dictated by the approach that you're taking. What we figured out at APImatic was to do SDKs at scale and make that feasible. So the ability to scale across APIs or across different languages. For example, if you're doing for one API, one team might be using different kind of specifications. The other team might be not even on open API spec. How will you standardize that? So we had to figure that problem out in terms of absorbing any kind of specification. Then the other team, one team might be using features of open API spec like one off or any off, but other not. So your generator must be able to handle all of these requirements. So productizing SDK generation sort of helped us solve those problems, at least for our customers. And again, like I said earlier, SDKs should not be mere API wrappers. They can do more in providing integration code to the developers. And the last thing is something that now is most crucial for scaling is automation, which means that everything should be configured in a way that the moment your API spec changes, there should not be a lag in providing your libraries on top or writing your documentation. It should be a one-click procedure. And with automation, we were able to achieve that for our customers, where a change in spec would sort of trigger the entire updation of the documentation, the guides, and the code samples, and the SDKs themselves. So in the end, again, when you're talking about business cases, it's about the KPIs. What are you achieving out of that? So these are some of the sort of KPIs after talking to hundreds of API programs, going through them over the last 6 years. We figured out commonalities in providing good developer experience, how they were measuring it. So the first thing that came up after providing a better developer experience was reduced white glove treatment. So if you're having that problem where your engineers have to get on the call with your partner or your customers all the time to make them understand how to integrate, how to debug the onboarding process, time to think about client code generation, think about improving your developer experience. We've seen that up to 40% drop in sort of support tickets for developers that happens. It means less engineering effort from your side, your engineer going in the support side of things, and of course, less trouble from your customers as well. Better onboarding. Again, this results in reduced onboarding time. So time to first hello world is pretty popular. Yes, that is what, 30, 45 minutes of the first journey. But what about time to the first, their production, sort of a production proof of concept, how to make that integration? how easy is it for your customers or your developers to make a production-ready code. So we started measuring that as well. And for some of our B2B customers, where it was 6 to 9 months, with better SDKs and better ecosystem around SDKs, they were able to bring it down to 4 to 6 weeks. And when that's happening, in the long run, in 6 to 7 months' time, we saw that ultimately the developers started choosing their API over competitor just because of onboarding time. So you're not just saving cost or not saving time for your developer, ultimately adding revenue stream to your business. And like I said, if that keeps happening, if you do SDKs right, they can actually redeem the investment, the enormous investments that most of the business now have done in API design and management as well. Do I have?
Yeah, I think you have 3 minutes, but if there is any question,
maybe I can take 1 more minute. I had a hidden slide. So since we were automating, everything, we figured out that we were able to do something more. That was a byproduct. So you have an ecosystem of multiple specs. What happens is usually we're talking about API catalog, and Mark O'Neill again talked about that catalog bit is now going down. It's overrated. Why? You have 200 services. You put 200 services in a catalog. That doesn't reflect the product, right? That reflects your internal architecture. So your product should reflect how the developers intend to use your services. So for example, for messaging, if email and SMS or voice API have to be clubbed together, we were able to merge them, validate them, and then generate code samples for them, and then filter different sort of interfaces for different users. So you can pick and choose on what to show to which users for internal customers or private or partner customers. And of course, automation goes in everything. If you have any questions, I'm here.
Yes, so thank you very much, Ameer, for making the time and coming here, and also sharing your perspective. So if there is any question from the audience, it's now your chance to ask him.
So, thanks for your talk, very insightful. About SDK discoverability, what do you think, what is your opinion on that? What are the best practices there? Because there's many ways to, have devs find your SDK. So any recommendations?
Yeah, that's actually a very good question. Like we know, marketplaces don't work. Whenever you want to use an API, what do? We either already know which API works, or you Google it up. So I think that's the first bit, to put your API down. So there's a lot of DevRel or marketing. So the way you market a product, I think that's where it should go for SDKs as well. If that bit is missing, your SDKs or your API might be great, but still it might not be discovered by the market. Right. And I think DevRel sort of activity around that is a must.
Thank you.
Thanks. Any other question?
Yes. The question is the tools is dedicated just only the API provider or the consumer? If I, as a consumer, I have the open API spec for the API, I can generate SDK to facilitate the integration?
Yes, you're right. You can do that. But then we don't encourage that. We encourage API provider to take that step. Like you said, one should not be putting the weight on consumer because you don't control the spec. You create an SDK, for example, yourself. The next day, they introduce something in the API spec, a new feature that's not supported in that in the code generator at that point in time. What are you going to do though? So ideally, it's best for the API provider to take care of that experience. Otherwise, it's hard for developers having no control over API design to generate SDKs on top of it.
Okay, thank you.
Any other question? If that's not the case, we go to the next presentation.
There is one though.
Ah, okay.
Yes, great talk. Thank you. I would like to know a little bit more about maybe how would you deal with code samples and generating them. Would you recommend any tool or approach for that?
I recommend APImatic though. But the thing is, there's a talk in Apidays Australia, I believe, that talks about detail in code samples. You need to do them right. It's a very important question because they should not be a snippet or a boilerplate code. They should be idiomatic code samples. So what we do is we generate the code samples for the SDKs themselves. These are not a reference code, and it's sort of editable or modifiable based on developer's requirement right in the console. So generic code doesn't work. It needs to suit the requirement of the user that's sitting there.